The 14th of June will mark 4 years since the Grenfell Tower disaster, when the tower block, the fire spread rapidly through the tower block due to the highly flammable cladding, killing 72 people. But despite the banning of the plastic foam insulation on towers in 2018, the cladding can still be used on lower buildings. And since the Grenfell fire, the material has been used to build an estimated 70 schools. Well, Jeff Barton, the General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, spoke earlier to Times Radio.
What we find out today is actually three things, I think. One is you've got around 70 schools that have got a form of insulation, foam insulation, that shouldn't be used. Then we find out that the government actually did a consultation around cladding on schools last year, but has never published the report. So quite what's going on there. And they've just started a new consultation before we found anything out about their recommendations. And then you've got people like the National Fire Chiefs Council saying that they think it would be hugely sensible that any new school that is built, A, doesn't just have all of that cladding and stuff, but also has built-in sprinkler systems. Again, the government simply refuses to respond to any of this. And I think a lot of people will listen to all of that and think, why are we not doing our very best to protect some of our most vulnerable people in society? That is, children who are there in large numbers day in, day out.
Jeff Barton speaking to us earlier. And we can talk now to Bob Blackman, who's Conservative MP for Harrow East and a member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. Bob, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for joining us. I know the committee of which you're a member has been looking into the whole cladding scandal. I mean, what do you make of the news that this plastic foam insulation that's been banned in towers has apparently been used to build 70 schools?
Well, it's amazing. I mean, I think I'm gobsmacked, really, because I think the reality is that we've been saying ever since Grenfell that we want to make sure that any buildings are reduced in risk of fire as much as possible. And clearly, the government's taken a strong stance in respect of tall buildings where people live. But we've been saying for a long time that schools, hospitals and other public buildings also need to be looked at so that any unsafe cladding is removed, and indeed unsafe insulation, as you've been saying on report. And to hear that schools have been built with it on after basically we've had this lengthy period of inquiry and recommendations that this cladding is no longer used is astonishing. I mean, I personally agree that all new schools should be built with sprinklers included, and indeed safe cladding, as far as you can have safe cladding. Non-flammable cladding should be introduced and should be used on all new buildings. And there's got to be a view of retrofitting existing schools where this unsafe inflammable cladding has been used.
We've already seen recently, I mean, a couple of very worrying fires, one on some student accommodation. But surely, if this plastic foam insulation was found to have, contributed to the terrible loss of life in the Grenfell Tower fire, it should be banned not just from tower blocks, but certainly from any public buildings at all.
Yes, indeed. I agree with you. And I think the reality is that the inquiry that's gone on into Grenfell has obviously been going through these various different recommendations. And as recommendations have been made, they've been implemented. But the reality is that we know that large numbers of schools, I mean, I can't remember the figure now about the number of fires we've had in schools up and down the country over the past few years, but they are, I'm afraid, far too many fires in schools. And to have unsafe, inflammable cladding on the outside of schools just adds to the risks involved. Because after all, when we're evacuating schools in the event that there's a fire, you've got to get the children and teachers and everyone else out of the building as fast as possible, and they've got to be safe, and that's clearly what we'd want to see. But to have things that will burn at relatively low temperatures, and we know cause immense problems for people. in terms of evacuating buildings, it just does not make sense. And so I think there should be a complete ban on these inflammable cladding that whether it's on low rise, high rise, or any buildings, and get to a position whereby buildings are made as safe as they possibly can be.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this blaze on the Bolton University halls known as the Cube in November 2019. 200 students had to flee. Photographs appeared to show some of the buildings' cladding catching fire and melting. This was a building that was... this was a building that was just less than 18 metres high. But surely the height of the building is now immaterial. We've seen the threat of these things. I mean, do you think that is the government going to come under pressure to act now to stop this stuff being continued?
Well, obviously there's been a risk-based approach. I mean, Carole, I think the government's been forced to take a risk-based approach to this on advice from fire authority chiefs. There is this concern about basically buildings that are 7 stories or more, obviously are having their cladding removed. That's full stop. There's no question about that. But the buildings 6 stories and below, they're taking a risk-based approach as to whether they should replace it or not. I mean, my personal view is that, if you're on the 6th floor of a building that goes up in flames and you've got inflammable cladding, then you're at high risk. You've got to be able to get out of that building. So my personal view is that we should be removing all unsafe cladding and replacing it with cladding that is far less flammable. I mean, everything will burn at a high enough temperature, but in terms of there are products on the market that can reduce the risk quite considerably, and that's what we should be doing. We should be using those products. The trouble is, of course, and this is where we come down to it's a bit more expensive. Well, I mean, I think you've got to take the point that what's the risk here? People losing their lives or spending more money on making sure that the building is safe. I'd sooner we spent the money on making sure the building was safe.
We know that the government has announced some help for, in particular, tenants in some of those high-rise flats. But there are also millions of tenants in buildings which, for various different reasons, don't quite fit the criteria. Do you think the government needs to do more to help the many, many residents who are trapped in this situation where they can't move or they can't sell their homes because they need the certificate to show that the building's safe? The building can't be made safe until work which can only be carried out by a small number of contractors is completed.
Well, let's be clear. I mean, the government have come up with £5.1 billion to do the tall buildings, the buildings of 7 stories or more. The problem is that only does the cladding. It doesn't include the other fire safety works that have got to be carried out in those substandard buildings. And of course, it doesn't cover the buildings that are 6 stories or below. The government have come forward with a plan to have what we call a forced loan scheme, whereby basically the building would be rectified and remediated, but then the cost of doing that would be assigned to the property, and then the leaseholders would only have to pay a maximum of £50 a month. Now, at the moment, we haven't seen the details of this scheme. Personally, I don't see how it can work. That's my personal view, because a lot of the leaseholders, I see some of these bills coming in. The leaseholders are getting bills for, I got one today where someone was saying they've got a bill for £100,000 for fire safety in a building that is 6 stories. At which point you go, well, that's ridiculous. How can anyone afford that? They're not going to be able to afford it. And the problem is that developers have put these buildings up. The leaseholders are the ones that are the innocent party in all of it. And I think what has to happen is that the government have to come forward with the funding to replace this cladding and then charge the developers through a development tax for the developers that build these tall buildings and the blocks of flats. Because without that, I'm afraid the innocent leaseholders are basically in flats that they can't sell. They probably can't get a mortgage. They probably can't get insurance either, and they can't sell because they're valueless at the moment because of the remediation costs. So we've got to come forward with a plan that remediates all of these buildings. we're not saying, by the way, that the taxpayer should pay, but we do think that at the moment the government is the only body that's got the funding capability to make all this happen, make the buildings safe, and then charge those responsible for the costs of it all. And I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Is there a wider problem here? I mean, it is 4 years since the Grenfell Tower disaster. As you say, the inquiry is continuing. That is clearly doing valuable and very thorough work in getting to the bottom of exactly what went wrong in this case. But that we're simply failing to learn some very, very basic lessons about safety, fire hazards, and the importance of putting fire safety at the heart of our buildings while we wait for this inquiry to go on. And in the meantime, we're building schools, public buildings, where children are going to be there taking their lessons who could be at risk.
Well, there's two elements to this. One is the regulations that were in the building regulations that were in force at the time, which, in my view, weren't fit for purpose and need radical reform to make it clear where the responsibility lies. There are some developers that can quite legitimately say, well, we built in line with the building regulations. This was signed off by inspectors. So therefore, why should we be held liable? I mean, there's a reasonable position. And I think under those circumstances, we've got to be saying, well, the public purse has to pick up the cost of that. But there are others, and this has emerged during the inquiry, and we've got to be a bit cautious here because there may be prosecutions involved, where the tests on materials were either not fit for purpose, or alternatively, there was some cheating on tests. This is true on fire doors, on cladding, and other materials. I mean, the reality is that if you put direct heat onto much of this cladding, it won't burn. But if you get underneath it, and it's almost like a chimney effect, then it will burn. And that's the problem. And that testing wasn't done at the time. And I think while we're learning the results of this, but clearly we need to be in a position whereby buildings are made safe. And since the inquiry started, obviously it's been producing very detailed evidence of what's gone on, and we're learning the lessons. But equally, we have to reform, in my view, building regulations and make very clear what is acceptable and what isn't. Because without that, we are going to, I'm afraid, have still a number of these cases where people are either suffering fires or alternatively being presented with huge bills to remediate the position.
OK, Bob Blackman, Conservative MP for Harrow East, member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.